Welcome everyone to shOPS Talk, episode 13. Super pumped to have my good friend Erol Toker on to talk all things revenue ops with this new lens that we're going to look at it on with product management. But before we get too far down the road with everything, as always, big thank you and shout out to everyone that helps put this episode on, especially our sponsors over at Salesforce and all the folks behind the scenes that do all the hard work and heavy lifting. Erol and I just get to come out here and talk and have fun. But very much appreciate everyone helping us get this through. So like I said, episode 13, which is kind of crazy to me, knowing that we've done so many of these. So for folks that are just joining for the first time, we'll pop the link to our YouTube channel over to catch up on other episodes. But without further ado, Erol, I'll let you take it away, introduce yourself, and we'll get things rolling.
All right, sweet, lucky 13. All right, intro, I guess I've been in software for about 12 years now. I started off at a company called Invite Media, which got acquired by Google, and I spent most of my time in product management there. And I spend most of my time, honestly, trying to help marketers figure out like how to work with data, which is not as straightforward as you think. Turns out you give somebody too much data, a lot of bad things start to happen. And I just fell in love with that problem set. And I just saw something similar in sales, jumped over and discovered a new passion for revenue operations. And, you know, it's crazy. It's been about 7 years since I made that leap, and so much has changed, right? So it's just a really exciting time and excited to be here.
I love it. I love it. Well, I'd be remiss if I didn't already start off with a big thank you for being such a high contributor to the WizOps community that we have. For those that are obviously on this call, you see the avatar, you see him all over the place in WizOps, and truly bringing a ton of value in all aspects of it. You know, one of the best parts of my day is jumping through all the threads and seeing all the different conversations we have. So, yeah, excited to dive into product management. And for those, obviously, that are on the call, most folks on sales ops, RevOps, Salesforce admin, of the likes, probably wondering why would we want to talk about product management with RevOps, but we'll dive into that. But I think the first thing that we want to talk about is, actually just why should we be thinking about this more? We'll start there. I think everybody has a hopefully high understanding of product management, but we can talk about what that is, but really why should we really be thinking about this as a priority as RevOps folks?
Yeah, for sure. And I think it's a pretty recent thing. And the reason I say that is, to contextualize why this has been relevant, and it's been a fairly new thing that I've been bringing up, I think, in the community is, go back 20 years, right? Everybody's talking about what is RevOps. 20 years ago, there was no RevOps. There was, IT owned CRM. It was all on-prem, and it was that, right? And then once we moved to the cloud with Salesforce, what we had was the SFDC admin, which is just another type of IT. And then I think in the last decade, it finally started becoming a little interesting. It became more of a tactical role, right? Which is, hey, we need to map to some sort of sales efficiency. And I think before things went crazy, it was like, oh, we got this efficiency problem, go buy this tool, integrate it. We got this efficiency problem, go buy this tool, integrate it. And that's kind of brought us to where we are now, which is everybody knows this, right? Our stacks are too big. Every product kind of overlaps with another product. Everything keeps changing every 2 seconds. Like we implement, tool A, and then already 6 months later, the new VP of sales is saying, hey, I want the competitor that we just evaluated. And I think just that fact, like the nature of this is changing from, it's like, hey, we're a hammer and everything's a nail, to there's infinite set of choices and we're in a really complex, rapidly changing world. And so if you just try to, hit everything the exact same way, it's not going to work. So it turns out that there is a discipline out there called product management that, answers these questions, and it gives you a lot of helpful frameworks. Like, given that we can build anything we want and we can go in any direction, what is it we should build, and why should we build it this specific way? And then how do we be thoughtful about this so that we think 2 steps ahead? And if this brand new cool thing comes along, right, what's going to give us the conviction to say no to that and resist those changes? So I think everybody's talking about like, hey, RevOps, like how do we become strategic? How do we get a seat at the table? And I think the way you do that is by facilitating these types of conversations and guiding people to the right end. So that's why I think it's relevant today. I don't think it was relevant like 3 years ago. I don't know what you think about that, but that's kind of my point of view.
I think you're spot on. It follows a lot of the same trajectory and a lot of the same conversations we have about RevOps, in a sense that 4 or 5 years ago, you saw one person owning these things. I'll tell you candidly, here in Atlanta, product management, that was a thing that I'm very confident and sure of, was a West Coast thing that we're bringing closer and closer to the East Coast and the Atlanta ecosystem. And there's, honestly, when you think about hiring for some of those folks, there's not a ton of them out there. Very, very, very similar to what we talk about with RevOps. 5 years ago, you had one-person shops or two-person shops. You look at it now, a ton of our customers, a ton of your customers have RevOps teams that are almost scalably roughly the same size as some sales teams and some marketing teams. And I think you hit a nail on the head of the complexity of the data and the complexity of the systems we use is one thing. But my first, I just have to be very candid here, my first dose of product management really came from my co-founder, Jack. That's almost his background exclusively, is in product management. And I remember he's challenged me a ton as a good friend, as a co-founder, as an entrepreneur. And he asked me why often. And he asked me why repeatedly. And one thing that we talked about, why so important. Let's dive into that, because I think it's a big piece to this of how product managers work and think, but also to make that segue for RevOps folks. Should we be asking why more often, or how should we be asking these type of questions?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's more of a how, right? Because it's like we should absolutely be asking the question. I think the challenge is a lot of people don't know how to ask the question. And there's a lot of parallels to this. Like in sales, the same thing, right? It's like people don't know how to ask for money, and it's a skill you're taught. Like, I don't think most people are inherently come into this world and grow up in these societies like ready to say, hey, when are you going to pay me? And I think that this is very much a set of taught skills. Now, product, you have all the way on the one end, you have Elon Musk and you have Steve Jobs and these visionary people. That's not what we're talking about here, right? It's, for every one of those people, there's about 10,000 other people who work in a product job somewhere. Like at Google, I didn't know what this was, and they trained me. It's something you go in, you learn, you pick up the basic skill sets. And so what you're saying is exactly right. It's like, why do we want to do this? Now, how do you ask that question without being contrarian, while being empathetic, because you know what's going to happen right after you ask why, right? You're going to ask why again and again and again. And you don't want to sound like a 2-year-old, and you don't want to sound right. So it's like, how do we show that empathy? These are techniques that you learn. And I think that's one way of looking at it. The other side of this is, I think, what actually led us to, or me, to start thinking about this product management thing, and a bunch of people in WizOps to put together this product management course for RevOps people is, if you kind of look at a lot of the questions that people are asking, like I actually wrote down a few here that I think would be interesting, right? So here's a hypothetical use case. Someone gives you a feature request, you build what they ask, and either they don't use it, or they keep asking you to make updates that make you say, I wish I'd known this sooner, right? You build the feature and people don't use it, or they only use a fraction of it, and it wasn't the part that you thought that was important. You say, I wish I'd known this sooner. Like that's, there's a bunch of people in your organization over there who are asking these questions. They have the tools and all that. So I think like this is very much something that we can teach in a way of thinking. And, I think we're gonna get to some examples on this call, but yeah, I think it's absolutely about why. I think it's just the how you ask those questions that matter.
Spot on. And it's funny, and well, first off, you mentioned the course that you're working on, and we've already got a bunch of folks from WizOps signing up for it. I'm gonna go ahead and drop that in the chat for everyone. Would love for y'all to join that. Obviously, you can follow the link and learn more about it. But it's funny, you mentioned you asked why, and you kind of sound like a 2-year-old. I was actually having this conversation with my wife last night. No, we don't have kids, but she was asking me, what's the topic for shOPS Talk tomorrow? I was like, it's product management. She's like, cool, what's that? And I was like, well, we talk about these principles of ask why 3 times, right?
Yeah.
Like you kind of sound like a 2-year-old. And I was like, well, well, yes, but also think about a parent in this. And it's kind of this weird epiphany we had. It's like a parent gets asked why all the time. 2-year-old is like, why is the sky blue? It's like, well, there's an atmosphere and there's things. Well, okay, well, why? It's like, well, when this thing was created, and they asked the third time, it's like, it's just because it is. It's like, that's just how it is. And I took that. I was like, man, what an interesting concept, because even in the RevOps world, we'll think with our product management hat on. But in the RevOps world and Salesforce admin world and system configuration world that we live in, we're asked to do a lot of stuff. Hey, I need a new opportunity stage, or hey, I need a new page layout, or I need this and that. And sometimes because we're somewhat wired in the RevOps world to be people of enablement and empowerment, we don't ask why sometimes enough. Like, you know what, I can do that. I know how to create a new button. I know how to create a new checkbox, etc. But that principle of asking why, and I think also we talk about this on so many different shows, there's such a fine art to gracefully saying no. That is something that I think we all learn just inherently from saying yes probably too many times. But yeah, it was such an interesting epiphany that we had on that. I was like, okay, it's very much like a 2-year-old, but sometimes we have to treat it that way. So
I think there's actually a quote about that, by the way. I forget if it's Carl Sagan. It's like every child is born a scientist, and then they go to school, and then we kill that scientific nature. I think it applies there, and I think there's so many parallels, because I think here, this is just not to sound cheesy, but what I keep telling everybody is like, look, guys, great artists steal. All of these things that we struggle with. I came from software, like building software, working with software developers. There is so much awkwardness and tension and difficulty and joy and greatness there once you figure out exactly how to run that. So it's not, it's not even bad no. It's like when you can say no to people and it's productive and they're like, you know what, you're right, I'm going to go back and come back with a more refined request. That's how you've made it as a team, So it's not even like building a position to say no to people or whatever. So that's one thing. Other thing that you said that I think is also interesting is, if you look at the parallels between product and engineering, what's happening in RevOps, I think another one of the reasons it's so hard to pin down like what RevOps is like, there's different kinds of RevOps people. Like some people are product-centric RevOps people that 5 years from now, RevOps teams, I think, will be like engineering teams and product teams, and there will be product managers and there will be people, developers. And it's so important to realize, like, this is one of the things that we're teaching in the course is like, if you start with a spec and then you go and develop, and then you have the discipline to stop developing when you deviate from the spec and go back to the spec and fix it, that is so important, because if you make a developer a product manager, guess what happens? Like the button gets moved right and then left and then up and then right and then left. And the next thing you know, 2 weeks have passed and we've kind of missed the point. So it's so important. Like this is all stuff that's been figured out in other contexts. And our goal is to basically say, what are the tools that we could just bring over so easily to just, benefit from that identical playbook. And my hope is by the end of this, through this course, it's not just about, it's not just like everybody's gonna be a product manager, but they're gonna understand like, oh, I'm kind of a developer, like that's like the stuff that I'm into. And these are my strengths. And so those are some of the things that we hope to sort of uncover a little bit too in the course.
I love that. It's interesting. You talk about some of these transitions, and it was honestly just yesterday. And I know we said we're going to talk about some practical examples, so we're going to tee up that for the next part of this conversation. But it was just yesterday I was catching up with Kent Smith, who's on here as well. Product, he's kind of done a little bit of I won't call it boomerang, but done RevOps, did product management, came back to RevOps, and him and I were having some of these same conversations about where these principles lie, why do we do the things we do. Why do we ask why so often? Another very similar transition, even here internally at Sonar, it was only 8 months ago, I hired Mitchell Blanchard, who was an early customer of ours, came over to be our sales engineer. Oh, that role lasted for all of 6 months, and he just started in product management this month. So he's 13 days into being a product manager, but comes from this entire Salesforce and RevOps space. And so I say all that because there's no linear path to go from RevOps to from RevOps to product management or product management to RevOps, but more so it's okay to start somewhere and evolve and keep evolving. So anyway, I thought about that. I saw Kent jump in. I was like, man, we were just talking about this just yesterday. So But when you think about practical examples, right? I think we, in theory, understand why it's so important to make sure we ask why often, make sure that we dig in. Is this really going to be valuable? What would you start to think about some of these practical examples that, especially folks on this call, either new into the RevOps world or tenured in the RevOps world, for however that works, because it's not that old. What do you think about some of these practical examples for folks?
Yeah, so let's just go back to like the most basic thing that everybody here relates to, right? Which is this thing where somebody gives you a feature request, you build what they ask, they don't use it, right? And then they come back and ask you to make one more tweak and one more tweak and one more tweak, right? So what's an example of this where if you do this and you don't follow the product management path, you end up somewhere terrible? And I think the other day, you and I were talking even before this, we were kind of brainstorming some of these things. A use case that's near and dear to my heart. So like what we do at my company, Truly, actually, we applied product management principles to this problem and we built a company around it. But the classic example of this is, hey, we want to track call outcomes to understand what's the best time of day to call, right? So at some point somebody says, hey, we need to put a little pick list here. So you put a little pick list there. Then they're like, you know what, actually, people are not filling out this pick list. So like, let's make it required. Okay, we go make pick list required. Then people are like, you know what, I kind of want to figure out like who we're talking to. Is it the DM? Is it a DM or not a DM or whatever? So you add that. And then you're like, oh shit, we now need, pardon my expression, we now need dependent pick lists. Oh wait, our software doesn't do that. Maybe we should go explore another software. And you go down this path. And so here's a case study from a customer that like we just published this study a few weeks ago. So if you go and actually do an audit, so you go and listen to call recordings, or you transcribe and do all that stuff. You do an audit of these fields, just call outcome, okay? For left VM as a disposition, 30% of the time at this customer, the rep doesn't leave a voicemail.
Yeah.
The disposition is left voicemail. And that just if you take it back to first principles, like, people don't like doing it. They don't do it right. And then when you really unravel it, you're like, this label is so ambiguous because actually, what is happening is they are hitting a voicemail 90% of the time. So it's like, it's not wrong. It's just 30% of the time they don't actually do the thing that is tied to that outcome. So you kind of look at that and you're like, this project is destined for failure from the beginning in so many ways. And so by now you're on your third software, you've done this, you've done that, you have validation rules, people are not using your CRM, everybody's unhappy, right? And so the question here is like, how do we go back to first principles? So I think why is important, but also first principles is also really important. I think that's a key concept in product management. And then you take a step back and then you start saying, why do we need to track this thing? Like, what's the cost and benefit of tracking, and what's the best alternative to putting that thing there? And why does this matter to the business? So this is what product management is taking that feature request and working backwards to what in product management we call the job to be done. That is like, we spend an hour in the course. Honestly, it's a 2-hour course. The first hour is the only thing that matters, which is figuring out what is the job that we're trying to solve here through these series of feature requests. Now, if you do this right, your universe as a RevOps person expands, and a whole bunch of things that we struggle with in RevOps starts to fall into place. Number one, for example, RevOps is a tactical function today. I think it can be strategic. I think if we become product people and lead conversations, it'll be strategic. Today it's tactical, right? And I want to say 60% of the time, I get a DM in WizOps with somebody talking to me about like, oh, I don't know if my culture is good or my alignment is good, or should I stay here? Should I do that? The problem is there's no strategy at the company, right? And I say that because 90% of the time there isn't a strategy. It's really scary, right? Like, you run a company, I run a company, we're kind of figuring it out. Like, it's not like there's no strategy. There's a bunch of stuff we haven't figured out. And yeah. So like, if you don't really know that strategy and you're working off this feature request, unfortunately, you're doomed to fail. You will never be successful. And so if you follow this process, number one, you are going to understand if you can be successful or not. Number two, you're going to be able to make that clear to somebody. Because when you make that clear to somebody, right? So Brad, somebody comes up to you and makes it abundantly clear they're not set up for success. You're CEO of your company. What happens?
if they come up to me and say they're not sufficiently set up for success, they're going to walk into this office thinking they're going to walk out very quickly. I'm going to say, no, we're going to sit here and we're going to drill into this. Like, bring your computer, maybe a big glass of water, and let's hang out. We're going to make sure we're going to fix this and get it set up the right way.
So either that, or you're going to be like, you know what, it's not that important, it turns out, because like I have more important things to do. But in no circumstance are you going to say, you know what, you're not set up for success, please go build that pick list, please build that. Like, that would never ever happen. So I think that's just a concrete example of where it's an endless rabbit hole. And I think that you have that problem in all areas of RevOps. Like our company's whole concept, for example, we just took those learnings over 8 years and basically said, you know what, let's just eliminate this manual data entry altogether, because they don't do it. They don't like doing it. And when they do it, it's incomplete or often wrong. So like, why even do it? So we spent 6 years building features to workflow tools to enable this mess. And then we spent 2 years building something that makes all of these things, all these features totally irrelevant. And so it's better for us, better for the customer, better for the end user. Now imagine that you bring that type of discipline mentality to your RevOps stack, right? What if it turns out that getting rid of 30% of your stuff has a 10% impact? Great.
Yeah.
What more can we do with that time, that capital, that creativity, all that goodness? So that's just how I think about it.
Yeah. Well, we've talked about this too, in a lot of, it's interesting. We talk about this in a lot of topics that we have with folks that come onto shOPS Talk. Rosalind, who joined us last episode, we were talking about this, and a lot of the topic theory was, how do you get the same thing with Jeff Ignacio? How do you get this sort of seat at the table? How do you grow in your career with it? Well, let's break down that pie chart that you were just talking about for a second. I'm going to take a quick short aside. I know we've got a little over 5 minutes left. We'd love to hear from y'all. If y'all have questions for Erol, for myself, product management, please drop them into the chat, drop them into the Q&A. But when we were talking about that with Rosalind and with Jeff and with others, we talk about that pie chart all the time. How much of your day is strategic versus tactical? And we talk about this with a lot of our customers, especially new folks that step into this role and they inherit this new tech stack. And they're like, man, somebody worked really hard building these crazy complex solutions to try to go solve this. One, they didn't document any of it, so that sucks. But two, I don't really know what I'm supposed to do with all of it. And we pause all the time and say a lot of that was because they're being very, very tactical. Part of being tactical sometimes, for better or for worse, is being very reactive instead of proactive. So it's grabbing principles like this, that if you can set yourself up for a little bit more of that long-term vision, like, well, you know what? We're going to build that. We're going to build it responsibly. We're going to ask why a handful of times. We're going to make sure we know what this end result looks like. We're not just going to build junk on top of junk on top of junk. And what we find so often is that it does compound, like terribly compound. So I don't know. It's just such an interesting one, but it all goes back. Sorry, like the first part of that thought was
first principles. First principles, all right? Because it's like the Supreme Court. Like when the Supreme Court hears a case, they never evaluate the case. The first thing they go and say is like, what are the 350 other decisions that came before this? And we're not really going to question those because we spent all this time and energy making that decision, and we're just rebuilding on top of that decision. And that's why what you're talking about, the compounding effect, that's where it comes from, because that's the way we think. And you're building a way of thinking. And that's why when you make a certain decision, that's what gives you the leverage to say no, because you're like, we've already said no to this, which makes it really easy to say, is this just another version of that? And if it is, then we don't even need to talk about it or take the sales call or do this or do that. And then that kind of like, I think brings it to like the last thing about like strategy. So what does it mean to be strategic? Like, what does product management have to do with being strategic? We just talked about an evolution. This was another WizOps conversation I had about 3 weeks ago. What does it mean to be strategic? So we talked about we're like the IT people, right? We're the analyst people, the IT people, then we're the tactical people. And so what does it mean to be strategic now? So if you look at how other functions have evolved, right? Like customer service is positioning itself as not a cost center strategic, how are they doing that? Right? They're aligning to the customer experience. So let me give you an example of where RevOps, like you can instantly reposition yourself, right? So what's the number one thing we talk about all the time? CPQ. Yeah. So everybody talks about, right? And so in the old tactical RevOps world, why is CPQ relevant? Oh, it makes our reps more efficient, right? And so that's okay. That's kind of like ops. That's boring. Think about like 4 years ago, right? 4 years ago, I get two things, right? A DocuSign, two products identical. One's a DocuSign envelope, one says fax me the signature. Which are you going to pick?
DocuSign.
DocuSign, right?
All day.
So, but the parallel to that in the e-commerce world is checkout. Like, we're not building CPQ, we're building checkout. And there's this, like, have you heard of Amazon one click and like what that does for your business? And all of a sudden RevOps is, right, we are at this point as close as it comes to owning the customer experience at scale, right? And so, what I just did, it's not a lot of wordsmithing. It's just, it happens to be absolutely the truth. And the only thing that's missing is just a little bit of just kind of really finagling things to like, again, why are we doing this? What are we trying to do here? And what are all the impacts that we're not even talking about what this function does?
Yeah.
I think that's the future. I think that's being strategic in RevOps.
I agree. And I think it goes back to first principles. It goes back to sort of, how are things being done efficiently? I love that mentality, like one-click checkout. And even if we just take that or take anything away from this whole talk, take that away as to how you go and build your framework now for your company. How do you go, look, at the end of the day, we're trying to be more efficient. We're trying to get that one click done. The last thing we're trying to do is make 5 clicks turn into 50. That nobody wants that. So starting with that mentality, begin with the end in mind, will certainly help that. So I love it, man. I know we're getting close to top of time. I'm gonna toss a couple of sort of random questions out there at you, and then finally one big one that will help. But the one thing that we always love doing is, like, again, toss some of these out there. So could be relevant to operations, to WizOps, could not be. But we'll start with an easy one. I know you're a proud dad, so this might be a moot point. But what are we watching right now on Netflix or listening to on podcasts these days?
Oh man, I don't think there's anything left on Netflix after. I don't think there's anything for us to watch in this family. So I don't know. Like right now, it's just kind of nerdy. I'm really into this thing on YouTube, Veritasium, and it's just a series. Actually, Salesforce is a sponsor of it, which I think is super cool. Just really short videos on physics and why the world works the way it works. It kind of aligns to this product thing. It's a really good exercise. So you want to stretch your brain a little bit and get in the product mindset, it's a good show to watch.
Oh, I love that. That's awesome. I haven't even thought about that on the science side of things. So now I'm going to be spinning my wheels on it. When you think of the folks that are on this call, just in a few short words, what's one of the first things they can really start doing tomorrow or later this afternoon to level up their game in some of these practices, especially relevant to the product management side?
Look at the gap between what people say and what they do. So like literally, so take what they're asking for and then go and observe their behavior. And so the gap between those two things is basically where all the product management happens. That I would say that would be the first thing. So somebody's like, oh, put a pick list here. First thing I'd say is like, if that pick list weren't there, what happens? And if the answer is like, well, not a whole lot, I would take a big step back and just discount. Yep. If the impact doesn't matter.
So good. All right, final one, because I know we're right at the top of time. If you were to rewind the clock, you fire up the DeLorean, go back in the past. You're obviously a RevOps leader now, amongst other positions and other titles that you get. But if you were to talk to your earlier self and give yourself advice about how do I go about getting into the operations role? How do I really excel? Because again, a lot of the folks that are on this call and watching the recording later on are early in the RevOps career. What would you sort of guidance give them, early folks in their RevOps career?
Join WizOps. and I'm only saying that because I think, like, if you go back to the beginning, we were talking about the evolution of RevOps. I think it is confusing as hell. Just think about one thing an investor said. Hey, you know how you sell to VPs of sales right now? Most of those guys, when they started their career, did not have email. Think about that for a second. And so today you're on LinkedIn, you're like looking at influencers talking about this, that, RevOps, there's a lot of negativity and positivity and confusion. And I think you need a community where you can ask questions and orient, because I don't think that there is a right answer or wrong answer. I think you need to hear 10 answers and decide for yourself. and chart your own course in RevOps, because I think the future is totally ambiguous. Like I said, I think it's going to be like software development. I think it's going to be a profit center. I think there's going to be specialization. I think there's all this stuff. And you're going to have to figure out where you're going to end up there in about 5 years. So I'd say join WizOps and ask as many questions as you can.
Yep. Ask as many questions as possible. It's funny you say that, the way these things are evolving, and I promise we'll wrap up. Again, talking with Kent yesterday about this, he said something, he's like, dude, you're kind of one of those like RevOps thought leaders. It's like, well, we've got 30 minutes that we're talking today. So I might know a little bit right now, but man, I'll tell you, by the time this call's over, the whole world has changed and I've got to go learn something new. So how do you go do that? You go join these great communities, ask questions, be humble, go ask a ton of questions, because there's folks like you that are willing to jump in, roll their sleeves up, answer them all, which is why we love having you in WizOps, love having you on the show. So Erol, as always, I know we're a minute or two over, but thank you, man. This was great. I can't wait to get this out to folks, get it on YouTube. We'll be sharing it out on social and everything. So thank you again for all the time, man. I'll let you get back to your busy day.
Thanks for having me.
Always. Again, thanks everyone for jumping on. We'll be coming back in about 2 weeks with another episode. So stay tuned. We'll send out the recording for this one as a follow-up, as well as the link to the course that we talked about during the show. So thanks again for everyone joining. Have a great rest of your Thursday. Talk soon. See ya.